How could an army of just 6,000 ragged and desperate Scots not only halt, but completely annihilate one of the most imposing military forces in medieval Europe? An English war machine of more than 20,000 men. We're not talking about a skirmish here, but a full-blown massacre. Was it a miracle from heaven, a divine intervention to save a nation on the brink? Or was it the result of a mastermind, a plan so brilliant and ruthless that it turned the enemy's greatest fortress into its own tomb? History remembers it as the Battle of Bannockburn, but it was actually a brutal lesson in how intelligence and obsessive preparation can shatter brute power. If you're fascinated by stories of military geniuses who achieved the impossible, subscribe and like, because what you're about to see will redefine your concept of strategy. To understand Bannockburn's madness, we must break down what the English army meant in 1314. They weren't simply 20,000 men. They were the culmination of the military revolution of Edward I, the dreaded Hammer of the Scots. This force represented the pinnacle of medieval warfare, a perfectly oiled combined arms system. Their heavy cavalry was unrivaled in Christendom, a shockwave of iron and fury. Their Welsh longbowmen had proven in Wales and Flanders that they could annihilate infantry and light cavalry at range with terrifying accuracy. They were veteran, professional warriors, equipped with the best military technology of the time. Engaging them in open combat was not a strategic option for any sensible commander. It was, plain and simple, a signed and accepted death warrant. The audacity of the Scottish decision is precisely what makes this story a legend. Robert the Bruce was no fool. For years he had perfected a brutal and effective guerrilla warfare, avoiding direct confrontation, harassing English supply lines, and using the wild Scottish terrain as his main ally. He knew that facing the English hammer head-on was suicidal. So why? Now, why risk Scotland's fate in a single, desperate, pitched battle? The answer lay in Stirling Castle, the strategic key to the kingdom. Besieged by the Scots, its English garrison had promised to surrender if an army did not arrive to rescue them by June 24th. Bruce was cornered. He could not give up Stirling, the symbol and center of his struggle. He was forced to make a stand, to risk everything in a single, terrible confrontation. To understand the magnitude of the Scottish miracle, one must first put the English Goliath in perspective. King Edward II wasn't marching to war, he was unleashing a walking cataclysm upon Scotland. Imagine a horde of between 18,000 and 25,000 men, one of the largest invasion forces of the time. At its vanguard rode more than 2,000 heavily armored knights, the elite of the elite, veritable medieval tanks bred for one thing: to break enemy lines with a devastating charge. Behind them rode thousands of the feared Welsh longbowmen, capable of unleashing a storm of arrows that obscured the sun and could pierce a knight's armor at 200 meters. This wasn't a simple punitive expedition, it was a force of annihilation. Its motivation was to crush the Scottish rebellion once and for all and reassert English rule over all of Britain. This army wasn't just a fighting force, it was a walking medieval city, the physical manifestation of the English crown's power. Behind the vanguard of knights and archers, stretched for miles, a colossal baggage train. Ox-drawn carts groaned under the weight of tons of food, barrels of wine, fodder for thousands of horses, and arrows numbering in the tens of thousands. Armorers and blacksmiths worked tirelessly at portable forges, keeping the steel in tip-top shape. Priests, servants, and lesser nobles completed this ecosystem of conquest. This entire enterprise was also a personal project for Edward II. Desperate to escape his father's towering shadow, he saw this campaign as his coronation, a crushing victory that would silence all his critics and cement his own legend. Beneath the royal banner of Edward II, the true military power of the English army lay in its turbulent and proud barons. Men like Gilbert de Clare, the young and ambitious Earl of Gloucester, and Humphrey de Bohun, the veteran Earl of Hereford, commanded their own retinues of loyal knights and archers. It was not a unified army in the modern sense, but a coalition of private armies, each vying for honor and glory. This structure was a double-edged sword. Under a strong king like Edward I, these tensions were kept in check, but under the vacillating leadership of Edward II, the thirst for personal glory of his commanders was a ticking time bomb. The pride of the English nobility, their greatest asset, would become the catalyst for their own destruction. And against this monster of steel and fury, what did the Scots oppose? A flesh and blood David. King Robert I of Scotland could muster barely 6,000 men, perhaps 7,000 at best. Don't get the wrong idea, this was not a neat uniformed force. These were farmers, hunters, and villagers turned into soldiers out of necessity. Their equipment was a patchwork of whatever they could find. Leather gambesons, old helmets, and above all lances. Long, sharp lances. The only cheap and effective weapon a foot soldier could use to keep a mounted knight at bay. They had barely 500 light cavalrymen, but what they lacked in armament, they made up for in heart. Their tour. Motivation was the purest and most powerful there is, survival. For them, there was no retreat. It was either victory or total annihilation. The main weapon of the desperate Scottish army was the schiltron, but it was not the same one the world had seen before. This formation, a hedgehog of long spears designed to nullify cavalry, had been the mainstay of William Wallace. At the Battle of Falkirk, however, this tactic revealed its fatal weakness. There, the schiltrons stood firm but static, becoming stationary targets that were systematically annihilated by the deadly hail of English archers. Robert the Bruce learned from that catastrophe. His genius was not in using the schiltron, but in reinventing it. For years, he trained his men not just to form a wall of pikes, but to move as one, to advance across the battlefield like a steel glacier. He turned a defensive formation into an offensive assault machine. Let's look beyond the formations and standards, to the heart of a Scottish soldier. He wasn't a professional warrior. He was a farmer who had laid down his plough, a Highland shepherd. His armor was a padded gambeson, his helmet a simple iron pot, and his weapon a 13-foot ash spear. As he stared out at the endless sea of English steel, he undoubtedly felt a knot of terror. He knew the odds were ridiculous, but the fear was eclipsed by a resolve forged by years of oppression. He wasn't fighting for gold, but for the certainty that if he failed, his home would be burned, his family subjugated, and his culture erased. It was the quiet fury of a man defending the only thing he had. That fury, multiplied by 6,000, was the true fuel of the Scottish army. But Robert the Bruce was no mere rebel. He was a tactical genius. His secret weapon wasn't a legendary sword, but the battlefield itself. He purposely chose Bannockburn, knowing it was a nightmare for a large, lumbering army. The terrain, flanked by forests and swampy streams, created a natural funnel that would force the English cavalry to attack along a narrow front. But he didn't stop there. For days, he ordered his men to dig hundreds of ditches, about 30 centimeters deep, known as pots, and camouflaged them with brush. They weren't meant to kill men, but to break the legs of war horses in mid-charge. And to greet those who survived, he perfected the schiltron formation, an impenetrable and lethal hedgehog of spears. Bruce wasn't going to fight a battle. He had engineered carnage. The genius of Bruce's traps, the so-called pots, lay as much in their psychological effect as their physical brutality. Imagine the scene from the perspective of an English knight. You're charging, feeling the power of your warhorse. Suddenly, the knight beside you collapses with a sickening crunch, his mount screaming in pain. Then another falls. Panic spreads faster than a gallop. A cavalry charge depends on momentum and confidence. By littering the countryside with this deadly uncertainty, Bruce forced every rider to hesitate. Should they blindly continue into a potential trap or slow down? Either way, the charge disintegrated, losing its cohesion and shock power. England's most feared weapon had turned on itself, paralyzed by the fear of what it couldn't see. Bruce's choice of terrain was a masterpiece of military engineering. Months before the battle, he had scoured every inch of the land south of Stirling. He knew that the old Roman road, the main route to the castle, was a deadly choke point, flanked by the marshy banks of the Bannockburn and a wooded, waterlogged area. Bruce didn't simply choose a good place to defend, he designed the battlefield. He forced the most powerful army in Europe down a narrow corridor where its overwhelming numerical superiority became a disadvantage, a mass of men hemmed in and unable to maneuver. The thousands of soldiers in the rear would be nothing more than helpless witnesses to the slaughter of their vanguard. Bruce was an architect of war. On June 23, 1314, the sun reflected off a sea of steel. The English army, with its banners waving, was a spectacle of might designed to terrify. In their ranks, the atmosphere was not one of tension, but of arrogance. For the noble English knights, the small Scottish force on the hill was an insult, a formality delaying their inevitable victory. They expected the rebels to flee in terror. On the other side, silence was another weapon. The Scots, standing firm on their prepared ground, watched the advance. There were no cheers, only a grim, silent determination. Every man knew the plan. Every man knew that his life depended on that of the man beside him. Robert the Bruce rode before them, not with promises of glory, but with a reminder of why they were fighting, for freedom. From the English lines, the atmosphere was that of a military carnival. The air vibrated with the impatient neighing of steeds, the metallic jingle of thousands of harnesses, and the confident murmur of the men-at-arms. The colourful banners of England's earls and barons fluttered lazily in the June sun. Looking up at the hill, the Scottish force seemed almost insignificant, a thin, dark line of stubborn peasants awaiting their inevitable annihilation. Surely the young knights were joking, betting on who would claim the largest ransom. Victory was not just expected, it was taken for granted. For them, it was not a question of whether they would win, but how quickly and with how much personal glory they would do so. It was the calm of a predator watching its prey. On the Scottish side, the atmosphere was radically different. There was no laughter, only a tense and solemn silence. Each man watched the English tide spread down the valley. But then, something extraordinary happened. Abbot Maurice of Incheffray walked slowly to the front of the ranks, raising a sacred reliquary. Seeing this, the entire Scottish army, from the highest nobleman to the lowest farmer, knelt as one. They knelt not in surrender, but in prayer. In the distance, King Edward II saw the gesture and sneered, believing they were pleading for mercy. A nobleman at his side, however, understood the truth and warned him, "Sire, they ask for mercy, yes, but from God, not from you. These men will conquer or they will die." The battle had barely begun when English arrogance boiled over. Sir Henry de Bohun, nephew of the Earl of Hereford, saw Robert the Bruce inspecting his lines, mounted on a small pony. Believing he saw an opportunity to decapitate the rebellion with a single blow, he lowered his lance and charged at full gallop. As the steel point swung toward his chest, Bruce, with preternatural calm, brought his mount into a nimble step to the side. Bohun's lance sped past. In that instant of imbalance, Bruce reared in his stirrups and brought his battle-axe down with tremendous force. The blow split Bohun's helmet and skull in two. A deafening roar exploded from the Scottish ranks. Their king was a giant. Morale had just become a weapon. Sir Henry de Bohun's challenge was not an act of strategy, but of pure, unchecked feudal arrogance. As a young nobleman eager to forge his own legend, he saw a golden opportunity for himself. Killing the rebel king in single combat would have guaranteed him immortal fame. On the other hand, Bruce's decision to accept the duel was, in tactical terms, madness. He was the king, the mastermind of the rebellion. Any mistake, and the entire plan would have collapsed. His death would have meant the end of Scottish resistance, but Bruce understood something deeper. At that moment, morale was more important than tactics. He needed to prove to his men that he himself was the embodiment of their cause. The impact of Bruce's axe resounded across the battlefield like thunder. The force of the blow was such that it not only split Bohun's helmet and skull, but, according to chronicles, it split the handle of the king's own axe. For an instant, there was stunned silence, and then the Scottish ranks exploded in a roar of savage euphoria. They had witnessed a miracle, an act of martial prowess that seemed straight out of a heroic saga. For the English, the sight was a terrible omen, a public humiliation that sowed the first seed of doubt in their hearts. It is said that the Scottish lords themselves admonished Bruce for taking such a risk, but the king had not just killed a man, he had murdered the morale of an army. Emboldened, or perhaps enraged, a detachment of English heavy cavalry attempted to flank the Scottish army. Hundreds of riders galloped forward, hoping to easily overwhelm the infantry, but they found themselves facing a steel porcupine. A Scottish schiltron, commanded by Thomas Randolph, moved as a single entity to intercept them, presenting a wall of pikes. The impact was a nightmare of rending metal and shredded flesh. The horses in the front line were impaled on the lances. The charge lost all momentum. In an instant, devolving into a chaotic and bloody heap. The cavalry, unable to penetrate the formation, were repulsed with horrific casualties. The first real test had arrived, and Bruce's tactics were devastatingly effective. The humiliation of the duel provoked an impulsive reaction. An elite force of several hundred cavalry, under the command of Sir Robert Clifford and Sir Henry de Beaumont, attempted a daring flanking maneuver. Their objective was to ride around the Scottish left wing and directly towards Stirling Castle. It was a textbook tactic. Robert the Bruce, however, had anticipated this move. He had entrusted his nephew, Thomas Randolph, with surveillance of that area. Seeing the English advance, Bruce pointed out the danger to Randolph, harshly rebuking him for his inattention. The personal affront drove Randolph to immediate, desperate action to redeem himself. Stung in his honor, Randolph led his infantry division out of the woods and formed a circular schiltron in open country directly in the cavalry's path. It was an act of incredible audacity. The knights charged forward, confident of an easy victory, but the schiltron did not budge. The first rank of Scots knelt, planting the butts of their lances in the ground to create an immovable wall of steel points. The clash was carnage. Horses were impaled. The knights, unable to break formation, surrounded the human hedgehog, futilely trying to find a weak spot. England's elite were humiliated, forced to retreat, leaving a trail of dead nobles. The lesson was brutal. The mobile schiltron was invincible. As night fell, King Edward II, in an act of incompetence that would go down in history, made a decision that sealed the fate of his army. He ordered his massive force to camp on a low marshy plain, wedged between two streams. It was a fatal mistake. Throughout the night, the mighty English war machine became a disorganized mob. The heavy war horses and chariots sank in the mud, discipline evaporated, and chaos reigned. They were trapped in a bottleneck, a quagmire that completely neutralized their numerical superiority. Morale, already battered, plummeted. The great English army was not camping for battle. Unwittingly, it had voluntarily walked into its own grave. The decision to camp in the lowlands is one of the greatest mistakes in military history. Why did they do it? The answer is a mixture of arrogance and a criminal underestimation of the enemy. Despite the setbacks of the first day, the English command could not conceive that the Scottish army would dare to launch a full-scale assault. Choosing the camp was seen as a matter of logistical convenience, not a critical tactical decision. They believed the Scots would remain on their hill, on the defensive. This arrogance prevented them from seeing that the seemingly flat terrain was actually a quagmire that would negate their main advantage: heavy cavalry. That night was torture for the common English soldier. Darkness brought not rest but misery. Imagine thousands of men and beasts crammed into a quagmire, with no room to set up an orderly camp. The exhausted soldiers struggled to sleep on cold, damp earth. The supply train was stuck, which meant little hot food. The morning's murmur of confidence had turned into a chorus of curses. From their miserable position, they could see the Scots' campfires burning high above on dry ground. Each light was a reminder of their mistake, a silent mockery of their precarious situation. The army's morale was drowning in the mud. At first light on June 24th, Bruce ordered the unthinkable. Instead of waiting for the attack, his schiltrons began to advance. Imagine the scene. 4 infantry divisions, bristling with lances, moving in unison, slowly and inexorably. The English cavalry, stuck in the mud, launched a desperate charge. It was then that Bruce's trap closed. The mighty war horses began to fall into the hidden ditches, their legs breaking. The charge turned into a chaotic slaughter. The few cavalrymen who reached the front crashed uselessly against the wall of lances. The Scottish advance didn't stop. It simply rolled over the mass of men and horses, a meat-grinding machine devouring the elite of European cavalry. At dawn on June 24th, Robert the Bruce made the boldest decision of his life. Against all military doctrine of the time, he ordered his entire army to advance. For the English, still struggling to organize, the sight must have been a nightmare. The hill roared to life and a tide of steel began to descend. It wasn't a chaotic charge, but a slow, disciplined advance. Bruce knew that time was his enemy. If he gave the English army a chance to organize itself, the battle was lost. His only chance was to attack while the giant was on its knees in the mud, disorganized and with its morale at rock bottom. It was a total gamble, a stroke of genius that broke all the rules of the game. For the English vanguard, the situation became a claustrophobic hell. At the front, The relentless wall of spears closed in. Behind, the weight of their own army prevented them from retreating. They were trapped in a human vice, crushed between the Scottish hammer and anvil of their own forces. When the knights attempted a charge, they ran into the minefield of ditches, creating a barrier of fallen horses that worsened the logjam. The Schiltrons' advance was slow, but terrifyingly steady. They didn't need to break the lines, they simply compressed them, crushing the soldiers in the front ranks who died of suffocation or were trampled without even having been able to raise their weapons. While their cavalry was being slaughtered, the English command unleashed its other lethal card, the thousands of Welsh longbowmen. They positioned themselves on the flanks and began unleashing a hail of arrows on the compact Scottish formations. This was the most dangerous moment for the Schiltrons, but Bruce was prepared. He had kept his small cavalry of 500 horsemen in reserve for precisely this contingency. At the critical instant, he gave the order. Sir Robert Keith led a lightning charge against the archers. Unarmoured and unarmoured, they stood no chance. The Scottish light cavalry crashed into their ranks, slashing and scattering them in a matter of minutes. The sky cleared of arrows. England's second great ace had been annihilated. Amidst the chaos, the English commanders managed to deploy their archers on one flank, finally, giving them a clear line of fire. This was the weapon that had won battles for England. The longbow was the artillery of the Middle Ages, capable of launching 10 to 12 arrows per minute over 200 meters, powerful enough to pierce chainmail. For a moment it seemed that history at Falkirk was about to repeat itself. The air was filled with the ominous whiz of thousands of arrows. The first volleys slammed into the flank of the Scottish formations, causing casualties and opening gaps in the wall of spears. It was the most critical moment of the battle. Bruce's brilliant strategy was about to be undone. But Bruce wasn't going to make the same mistake as Wallace. He had kept his light cavalry, some 500 hobelars under Sir Robert Keith, in reserve. At the first sign of the arrow hail, Keith unleashed his charge. It was a lightning attack on the archers' exposed flank. Concentrating on their targets, they were taken by surprise. Unarmored and armed only with daggers, they were easy prey. The cavalry tore through them like a hawk among pigeons, slashing and trampling. The archer formation disintegrated in a blind panic. Within minutes, England's most lethal weapon was silenced forever. Edward II's last tactical ace had been removed from the table. Just as the English spirit was about to break, Robert the Bruce unleashed his final blow, a masterpiece of psychological warfare. On a nearby hill, what appeared to be a new and large Scottish army suddenly appeared, screaming and running into battle. For the English troops already trapped and demoralized, this sight was the final straw. More enemy, fresh reinforcements. Panic gripped them, but the reality was different. That reserve wasn't soldiers. It was the servants, cooks, and camp staff. Bruce had ordered them to make as much noise as possible. It was a deception as simple as it was brilliant, breaking the English army's last shred of will to fight. Those who emerged on the hill were not soldiers, but the soul of Scotland. They were the small folk, the encampment personnel, young, old, cooks, servants. They were the people for whom the fighting was taking place. Bruce's order was a stroke of genius that transformed non-combatants into a psychological weapon. By waving sheets like banners and banging pots and pans, they became a phantom army. Their participation meant that the battle was an act of total war, where every member of the Scottish nation, armed or unarmed, had a role to play. Victory would not belong to the warriors alone, but to the entire people. From the perspective of an exhausted English soldier, the sight on the hill was the apocalypse. His mind, overloaded with horror, could not process the scene logically. What he saw was a savage horde descending upon him, a swarm of fresh and ferocious enemies. The dissonant noise was even more terrifying than that of a disciplined charge. It seemed like the eruption of a primal fury. It was this psychological terror, this image of an inexhaustible enemy, that finally broke the English soldier's spine. The will to fight disappeared, replaced by the most basic instinct of all, to flee at any cost. Panic has a domino effect, and it started at the top. Seeing the total collapse, King Edward II himself decided to save his own life. His flight from the field with the retreating royal standard was the unmistakable signal to every English soldier: save yourself. The most powerful army in Europe disintegrated. Discipline, evaporated, and a terrified human tide tried to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The very ground that had trapped them became their slaughterhouse. Hundreds of men drowned in the Bannockburn or became bogged down in the mud, easy prey for the Scots, who began the hunt. The retreat turned into a disorganized slaughter. Edward II's escape was a spectacle of royal humiliation. He galloped first toward Stirling Castle, but the governor refused to let him in, knowing the castle was doomed and that harboring the king would only invite a relentless siege. Repulsed, Edward was forced into a desperate and perilous flight across the countryside, relentlessly pursued by Scottish cavalry. The King of England, the sovereign of the most powerful nation in Western Europe, was being hunted like an animal on the lands he claimed, a perfect symbol of the total collapse of his authority and power. The Bannockburn became the main agent of the carnage. It was not a long river, but its banks were thick and muddy, creating a deadly gorge. Thousands of panicked soldiers converged on the few crossing points. Heavily armored knights drowned in less than a meter of water under the weight of their own steel. Infantry were trampled or stabbed in the back. The stream became so clogged with the corpses of men and horses that, according to accounts, one could walk across them. The terrain, Bruce's secret weapon, dealt its final and cruelest blow. When the pursuit began, the Schiltron's iron. Discipline dissolved into individual fury. Years of oppression and burned homes exploded into brutal revenge. Every Scottish soldier had a personal score to settle. This was no longer a tactical engagement. It was a hunt. The Scots, lighter on foot and more familiar with the terrain, pursued the mud-ridden, panic-stricken English. Mercy was in short supply. Bruce's tactical victory turned into a bloody purge at the hands of his men, ensuring that the invading army was not only defeated, but virtually exterminated. When the sun rose over Bannockburn, it revealed not glory, but the price of freedom and the cost of arrogance. The ground was littered with thousands of English bodies. The numbers are, to this day, hard to believe. While the Scots suffered only a few hundred casualties, English losses were catastrophic, with estimates ranging from 4,000 to 11,000 dead. The victory was absolute and also incredibly lucrative. Dozens of English lords and barons were taken prisoner and exchanged for astronomical ransoms. Furthermore, the English baggage train, worth £200,000 at the time, an unimaginable fortune, fell intact into Scottish hands. Bruce had not only won a battle, he had secured his nation's funding for years. The battlefield the following day was a marketplace of power. Dozens of English nobles were now valuable prisoners. Men like Humphrey de Bohun, Earl of Hereford, were captured. The ransom system was the economics of war. Every baron had a price. His capture not only enriched Scotland, but also decapitated English military leadership on the border. Most significant was the exchange of the Earl of Hereford for the wife, sister, and daughter of Robert the Bruce, who had been held captive in England for 8 long years. For Bruce, this was perhaps the most personal victory of all. The capture of the English baggage train was the medieval equivalent of winning the lottery. It contained the apparatus of a royal state on campaign. The king's personal chapel, his luxurious furnishings, his wardrobe, and his war records. Siege weapons, armor, and high-born horses all added to the loot. For a poor kingdom like Scotland, this massive injection of capital was transformative. The Bannockburn treasure not only paid Scotland's debts, but funded its ability to take the war to northern England in the years that followed, invading and plundering with previously unimaginable wealth. Bannockburn was much more than a battle. It twisted the course of British history. Although it would take England until 1328 to recognize it, Scotland's independence was forged in blood and steel on that field. The victory secured Robert the Bruce's place as an immortal hero and undisputed king. In contrast, Edward II's prestige was shattered, hastening his eventual deposition and death. Militarily, the battle was a lesson for Europe. The era of the lumbering knight as master of the battlefield was over, and for Scotland, Bannockburn became the pillar of its national identity, immortalized in its unofficial anthem, Flower of Scotland. Internally, Bannockburn was the foundation that solidified Robert the Bruce's reign. Before the battle, his claim to the throne was still contested by rival factions. The crushing victory was seen as a sign of God's favor, a divine judgment that legitimized his crown. The previously hesitant Scottish nobles rallied around him with fervent loyalty. The rebellion was transformed into a unified and confident nation. Robert I ceased to be the leader of a faction and became the undisputed king of all Scots, the architect and guardian of their sovereignty. Independence was not just won from England, it was forged internally at Bannockburn. For England, the defeat was a deep and festering wound. It was a national humiliation on a scale never before seen. The aura of military invincibility built by Edward I was shattered. The authority of King Edward II collapsed. His barons used the incompetence demonstrated at Bannockburn as political ammunition to challenge his power, leading to years of internal conflict that culminated in his deposition. Financially, the disaster was equally dire. The cost of the expedition, coupled with the loss of treasury and ransom payments, left the English crown on the brink of bankruptcy. More than any political consequence, Bannockburn became the fundamental myth of the Scottish nation. It became the supreme example of the victory of the oppressed, proof that courage and intelligence could triumph over tyranny. The battle was immortalized in John Barber's epic poem, The Brew. For 700 years, the Bruce's story has served as a rallying cry and a source of national pride. From the Jacobite Rising to modern debates about independence, the spirit of Bannockburn is invoked as the defining moment when Scotland stood up and, against all odds, declared to the world that it would not be subjugated. The story of Bannockburn resonates to this day. In the midst of his chaotic flight, King Edward II, fearing his Privy Seal would fall into enemy hands, got rid of it to prevent forgery. For centuries, this was just an anecdote. But in 2019, an amateur metal detectorist unearthed a small medieval copper mold. Experts believe this artifact was designed to forge Edward II's Privy Seal. It is an echo of nearly 700 years, a silent testament to the king's panic and the scale of his defeat. Proof that the past never truly dies. It simply leaves buried clues, waiting to remind us of the day a king fled and a nation rose. The king's Privy Seal was not a mere ring. It was the key to the secret administration of the kingdom. While the Great Seal was used for public documents, the Privy Seal authenticated the monarch's personal correspondence and direct orders. In enemy hands, it could be used to issue false commands, pardon traitors, or sow discord. Edward II's decision to part with it reveals his panic. Somewhere, riding for his life, he made a critical decision. It was better to be temporarily powerless than to risk having his power usurped. The act of throwing away that small metal object was, in essence, the king abandoning the very symbol of his authority to save his skin. The discovery of the forgery mold in 2019 opens a fascinating window into the underworld of the period. Who would have made it, and how quickly? Would it have been an enterprising Scottish soldier who found the original seal and saw an opportunity? Or, more intriguingly, could it have been an English opportunist amid the chaos of the retreat, planning to create forged documents to steal supplies? The existence of the mold suggests that news of the seal's loss spread quickly. This shows us that, amid the clash of armies, history is also shaped by thieves, forgers, and anonymous survivors who see opportunity in the chaos. And so, the saga of Bannockburn concludes. A story that begins with the march of one of Europe's greatest armies and ends with a small, corroded piece of copper found in a field almost 700 years later. This humble artifact serves as the last tangible link to the past. It reminds us that the most monumental events are ultimately a collection of human moments. The hubris of a knight, the genius of a king, the determination of a farmer with a spear, and the panic of a monarch on the run. Bannockburn wasn't just a battle, it was the forging of a nation. A timeless lesson that indomitable will, combined with brilliant strategy, can indeed bring down giants. An echo that still resonates beneath the feet of modern Scotland.